I was a little taken back by the they're very proud to cast a Latino actress as Snow White.
Yeah.
But you're still telling the story of Snow White.
Snow White, yeah.
Seven Dwarfs.
Sure.
So take a step back and look at what you're doing there. It makes no sense to me. You're progressive in one way, but you're still making that fucking backward story of seven dwarves living in a cave. What the are you doing, man?
How's it going? My name is Otis Never Soft Again, and recently I was diagnosed with erectile dysfunction.
This is Plausibly Live.
A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. Wait, that's the wrong story. This one starts like this. Once upon a time, there was a place where people got jokes. I get jokes. Maybe they didn't like the joke. Maybe they didn't appreciate the joke. But generally speaking, we got jokes. And we understood that there was humor, even if we didn't like the humor, even if the humor was maybe at my expense. This is one of the reasons why I liked Doonesbury so much back in the day, was because I got the humor. Even if it was offensive to me, even if it was something I didn't want to hear, even though it was most of the time aimed at me, I still enjoyed it. I thought it was funny. And I got the joke, and I laughed. And then, in 1994, the world began to change. And a new term that we had hitherto not really heard before began to make the scene. The term was politically correct. And it began to infiltrate our society. I had spent most of the 1980s insulated. I was in the Navy. I was underwater most of the time. When I wasn't, I was in school or doing other things. And so for me, I hadn't really watched culture in the 1980s other than music. But as this politically incorrect idea began to inculcate into our society, things began to change. And all of a sudden, humor was not quite as permitted as it used to be. In 1994, there was a book that came out. It was called Politically Correct Bedtime Stories, Modern Tales for Our Life and Times. And it was a retelling of traditional fairy tales and bedtime stories in a politically correct way. Now, this was important because there was a good deal of controversy about this book at the time that, well, it was satire. It was an attempt to make fun of this culture of politically incorrect intolerance, as it were. And in fact, there was a great deal of humor in the book that if you understood it, you got it. If you didn't, well, you probably were mad about it. One of the stories that they cover in the book, of course, is the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which in the politically incorrect version is a little bit different, because of course they are. The Seven Dwarfs are referred to as vertically challenged men, and they run a retreat. The seven vertically challenged men run a clinic for men who want to indulge in primal behavior. Now, even in 1994, that was a little cloudy. Nowadays, you can't turn on the radio or the iHeartRadio app or the TV without getting inundated by commercials for ED medications and treatments. That's essentially what they were selling at this vertically challenged retreat for men wanting to indulge in primal behavior. And of course, the story follows the main story, which is the queen pretending to be an old woman, sells apples which are poisoned, but she gets to talking to Snow White and they bond. You know, womanly stuff, they bond. And they forget that the apple is poisoned. She shares it with Snow White, and they both end up comatose on the floor. Meanwhile, the vertically challenged men, returned with the prince, who is at the clinic. He wants to engage in primal behavior, and he is, well, let's just say he needs ED treatment. And the vertically challenged men decide that the perfect cure for his impotence is this nubile coma victim. That's what they call her. And he decides that he should ask to engage in biblical relations with her, at which point the vertically challenged men decide, this is a genius plan. This will cure his impotence. And they decide to put her on display and charge him more money, which they do. When they try to move the two women's bodies, though, the poisoned apple dislodges from their throat, which actually happens in the real movie, in the real story. The women awaken. They're angry. As it turns out, they've been conscious the whole time, just comatose and unable to act. And they're pretty pissed off. The queen decides that the 7 vertically challenged men are trespassers. She throws them out of her forest. And she and Snow White accuse the prince of being a misogynist and potential, rapist. They throw him out, and they open a spa for women on the side of the thing. Now, that's the politically incorrect story. Of course, in the original Disney story, it's a little more, traditional, I guess. And I'm not one to sit here and say that all these fairy tales, as Disney told them back in the 40s and 50s and 60s and even into the 70s, were great. I'm not saying that. Many of the stories had different original endings. But as a general rule of thumb, they were family-oriented and pleasant stories, as opposed to some of the original endings. And the politically incorrect version began to retell this story because, obviously, it needed to be retold. Well, the good news is that Disney, as many of you may know, has begun remaking movies of remakes. So, back in the 90s, they did a remake of The Haunted Mansion, which wasn't actually a movie, I don't think it was, but it was a record album. So they redid the movie with Eddie Murphy, and for the record, I thought it was pretty good. As those movies go, Pirates of the Caribbean, but now they're redoing The Haunted Mansion again, and now it's got other people in it, and we'll see what happens. And they have decided that the original Snow White isn't good enough anymore, and so we're going to redo the new Snow White. Well, of course, they have cast an actress who is not monochromatic. And I understand she's Latin, or Latinx, I guess is the way the politically correct would say it. But she is wearing the traditional Snow White dress. And this is great, right? And so when they came out and announced this, everybody was excited. We're going to redo Snow White and 7 Dwarves, except for one person. One person was really mad about this, and you won't be surprised to learn that it was Peter Dinklage. Yes, that Peter Dinklage, who went on a podcast, a Mark Maron podcast, and threw an absolute, can I say this still, bitch fit about how dare they do this, how dare they would remake this story. Disney announced that the magical creatures would replace 7 dwarves to avoid reinforcing stereotypes after Game of Thrones actor Peter Dinklage criticized the, quote, fucking backwards story, unquote, last year. Quote, I was a little taken aback when Disney, were very proud to cast a Latina actress as Snow White, but you're telling me the story of Snow White and the 7 dwarves? It makes no sense to me. You're progressive in one way, but you're still making that fucking backwards story about 7 dwarves living in a cave together. What the fuck are you doing, man? Have I done nothing to advance the cause from my soapbox? I guess I'm not loud enough, he said. And so, as you know, the 7 dwarves, or 7 vertically challenged men, were replaced with 7 magical creatures, only one of whom is vertically challenged. The rest are whatever. And off we will go with the new version of Snow White. Now, keeping in mind that Disney has lost over $900 million, I guess. $billion? Is it 900 million or 900? Doesn't matter. They've lost a ton of money over the past few years over really bad movies. You'd think that they would say we're in the business of making movies that entertain people and that people will pay to see. But that may not be the case. Because once upon a time, what was a joke, the politically correct bedtime stories, has become the reality. It has become the de facto story now. And you say to yourself, well, how can this be? How can we have reached the point where satire has become reality in our world? And yet, it's not all that unusual, is it? We live in a world today where what once was considered absurd, ridiculous, weird, stupid, is now not just mainstream, it's not just normal, quote unquote. We are told that if we don't accept the normality of it, we're the bigots. We're the problem. If you're someone who wants the original Snow White story, that's because you hate dwarves. Sorry, vertically challenged people. It's because you're, quote, fucking backwards, unquote. That's the point we've reached. And I think we hit the peak of that, not with the new politically correct telling of the Snow White story, which, again, I will not see. I don't know anybody who will pay to go see it, but I'm sure somebody will. Won't be me. That's not even the peak of stupidity. The peak of stupidity is when you open up your newspaper this morning. Open up your newspaper. See, that's one of those phrases that I still use. I haven't read a physical newspaper in ages. What I mean by that is I open up my internet and I start reading stories that have been sent to me by various people or by aggregators or whatever. That's what I mean when I say, see, that's how the world has changed. That things have changed meanings and stuff like that, right? So I open up my paper this morning and what am I hit with? Dylan Mulvaney's nipples. No, I'm not kidding. Dylan Mulvaney, who is a dude pretending to be a chick, apparently put on a blonde wig or dyed his hair blonde, I don't know, and went to some sort of event where he exposed his nipples. That's right, the Bud Light guy who pretends that he's a chick, who mocks womanhood because it's now politically correct to do that. It's now politically correct, you see. The joke has become the reality. So much so that our papers are full of Dylan Mulvaney's nipples. And I go back to what I've said before, and I will continue to say, and I think it applies both to Snow White, the new Disney version, driven by Peter Dinklage's outrage, as well as Dylan Mulvaney and his nipples. Simply this. I've said it before. I will say it again. Attention whores are gonna attention whore. It's what they do. Only now, what was once the joke has become the attention whore.